I'm pleased to moderate this session on demographic change, and it may be, in the long run, perhaps the single most important fundamental change underway in both China and Japan. Our speakers will speak from 10 to 12 minutes, and my instructions are to rudely stop them after 12 minutes. And so I will try to give them a warning in 10 minutes, but at any rate, in order to have enough time for discussion, I'll have no hesitancy in asking any of our speakers to sort of refrain from. The dilemma always is that when we have a panel like this, they know so much and they have so much to say that how they set their priorities is a big challenge. I'm not going to introduce the speakers at any length since we have their brief bios in the materials. The first speaker is Richard Katz, who's been a long-term specialist on the Japanese economy. He's editor-in-chief of the Oriental Economic Report, and the title of his talk I just saw up here for the first time is Japan got rich before it got old, Chinese got old before they get rich, something like that. You all can see it, I can't. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to you, and I've got my watch set. That's a problem. It's always a problem with you,
Yes.
Rich.
Hi, good morning. I just looked up the World Bank figures and I was really quite astonished. In what's called purchasing power parity terms to make everything, pricing everything equal, China's per capita GDP today is where Japan was in the 1950s. So you're talking about a country which is still overwhelmingly poor, despite what you might see on the streets of Shanghai or Beijing. And it's one thing to experience low growth after you've reached a certain level of a comfortable living standard. But when you're already very, very poor, if you're growing 7% a year per capita, well, you're going to double your living standard every 10 years. After 40 years, your living standard has risen 16-fold. That's tremendous. On the other hand, if your per capita GDP is growing only 2% a year, it's going to take you 35 years to double. So at 10%, in 40 years, you've gone up 16-fold, and at 2%, in 40 years, you basically doubled. And that's a problem. Now, part of that problem China has is the demographics. So the problem is not that population is declining. That's not the problem. The problem is aging, which is, if you look at this is Japan, starting in 2000, this is a projection. If you look at the gray line, that's the decline in the total population. If you look at the black line, that's the decline in the number of people of working age. And this is Japan, it's about the year 2010, and China is sort of at the beginning of that process now. The working age population in China, age 15 to 64, began an absolute decline in the year 2010 or 2011. So that's their problem. Now, what happens is, sorry for the arithmetic, but this is the way life is. Basically, growth in GDP is very simple. Growth in the number of workers and growth in output per worker. So if the number of workers is growing 1%, and each worker can produce 1% more per year, then 1 plus 1 equals 2. Terrific, all right? But here's the problem when this ratio between the workers and the total population changes. Suppose the number of workers is dropping 1% a year, and the output of each worker is still growing 1% a year. So you got -1, the drop, the increase in productivity. So you're basically at zero growth of GDP, right? But if your population is stagnant, so the number of workers is declining, but your population has got zero growth, then basically you have zero growth per capita. So even though the output per worker is growing 1%, the output for the entire population is zero. And that's the problem. In order to keep per capita growth going, you have to have even faster growth rates of worker productivity. And that gets harder and harder to do just by pouring in more capital. And this has already hit China, right? So the average in the in the 2000s decade was per capita GDP was growing about I can't even see my own numbers here the way this thing, 9.6% a year. Let's call it 10%, right? 9.6% a year. That was the average. Last year, this had dipped down to only 6.4%. However, if we look at this gray area, that is what would have happened to per capita GDP if they hadn't had this demographic crunch, if they had not begun to run into the problem where the number of workers is starting to slow down while the overall population is still increasing. And so per capita GDP, instead of going from 9.6 to 6.4, would have gone from 9.6 to 7.8. In other words, half of the decline in Japan and China's per capita income growth was from this demographic factor. Deng Xiaoping did a lot of terrific things for the economy, but the one-child policy is a horrific mistake, in my view, and the chickens are now coming home to roost on this. Now, what is the problem? Why is this a problem? Again, it's intergenerational. You look at, in Japan, back in I'm sorry, I have to keep looking down because I can't see my own numbers the way the angle is here. So this is like 1960, it looks to me. There's like 5 working age people for every retiree, every senior. And it is heading, it's now about only 2, and it's heading toward 1.4. So in other words, each worker has to provide the wealth and the income of the country to finance the ability of these older people simply to survive, where they get their food from, whatever. It's the working people who produce the income in the country. If you look at the ratio of actual people working to the total population, to the non-workers rather, of any age, what you see in Japan is during the high growth era from the 1960s up through, and then afterwards, even through the year 2000, that the workers were growing faster than the overall population. So in fact, even if per capita, per worker GDP, you say was 1% a year growth, you get per capita GDP of 2%. Well, this peaked out around year 2000. Now that it's going downhill. And so the demographics are working against living standards. China is now about at that peak and just starting its downhill thing. So what happened in Japan really is China's future. Now, again, the only way to overcome this, if you have fewer workers for each non-worker, the only way you can keep living standards even the same, let alone have them grow, is to have better and better productivity for each worker. And what you had in Japan was, in fact, just at the time when you need an acceleration of productivity growth. In fact, what you had is a slowdown. Emerging countries, developing countries, just by pouring in lots and lots of more machinery can really boost labor productivity growth. But once you mature, that becomes harder to do. You run into diminishing returns. You then have to not just work harder, but work smarter. Not more bucks of investment, but more bang for the buck. That is the problem China faces now, as I say, when it's already still a poor country. Now, what does this look like in terms of what it actually does to the economy and what it does to politics? Well, one thing it does is, if we look at the poverty rate in Japan, there's a huge difference between what happens to the poverty rates of working age people and retirees when you consider what's the poverty rate before the government uses taxes and distributions and subsidies to anti-poverty measures. So in Japan, what you had was, before the government does anything, the poverty rate was 20%, which is already a high poverty rate for Japan. It's the second highest poverty rate in the OECD. It did not used to be the case. It's one of the products of the lost decades. After the government spent money on anti-poverty measures, that was reduced to 14%. Right? Now if we look at old people, 64% of them, I mean, these are people who are relying mostly on pensions or their widows or whatever, 64% of them in terms of are living in poverty. And then the government comes in and then has all the Social Security and subsidies and this, that, the other thing to reduce it, and they reduce it to about 19%, which is still higher than for working age people. But that white box shows you the way it reduced the poverty was a transfer of income from working age people to retired people. Now, as you get more and more of these retired people, that means you've got a problem. You can't help the old people unless you take it away from the working age people. So you raise consumption taxes in Japan. People don't like it. It's very, very hard to do so. And suddenly, here you have a political party. It's in one sense, very similar between Japan and China, right? The Liberal Democratic Party in Japan was a catch-all party. That is to say, a coalition of almost everybody except actual unions, but there was certainly a coalition of working people. So they wanted, and if they're having high growth, if the pie is growing, you can give everybody a bigger slice. But when the pie is barely growing, you can't give somebody a bigger slice unless you give somebody else a smaller slice. And that's the political problem, and that's the political as well as economic problem for China, which is you cannot maintain this growing ranks of old people if growth is slowing down. You can't do it without raising taxes on the young, cutting the benefits to the old, and therefore more of them die. It raises all kinds of economic and political problems. Now, what does it actually look like? What time do I have?
You have 3 more minutes.
Okay, let's call it 6. All right, so, because we believe...
call it 6, but it will be 3.
Because I'm going to get 6 minutes worth of words into 3 minutes. Let's see how we do here. Productivity, we want to grow. All right, look. So let's look what it looks like. First of all, sorry about that. Okay, this stuff I've already had, points 1, 2, and 3. What you already have is budget cuts for elderly care in Japan, for sick people in Japan, for cuts in education. In most rich countries, high school education is free. In Japan, it's not. Families are paying thousands of dollars per year. The older people vote. And so the budgets are much more determined to helping out the older people than they are the younger people, so that Japan is not investing in its future. Right? So you have older people more and more living with strangers because the age of the nuclear family, the children don't want them coming to live with them. And this becomes a problem. You have negligible returns on the savings. There's a whole, I'm not going to get into that part. What happened here? Okay, tell you what, I guess I didn't do this part here. So I'm just going to talk with no slides. Okay, no safety belt. Okay, look, you go to these towns in Japan that are depopulating, and I thought I had that someplace, but these incredibly depopulating towns, thousands and tens of thousands all over Japan. They're filled with old people, they're rural towns. The young people who go to college do not come back. You've got abandoned homes, you've got abandoned farms. These towns have now become so small that there is no supermarket in the town because the supermarket can't make money. So these people don't drive, they can't walk to a local store. How do they get the food? It's got to be delivered, which is expensive, or they have to somehow get it. They don't have enough of a tax base. You have pipes that are corroding, and they're not fixed. Right? There's terrorists.
20 seconds.
Whoa, baby. All right. The point is, I think if you go to these rural areas in Japan and you see what actually happens to the life of people, and if they lose all their friends and neighbors, growing cases of depression, alcoholism, dementia, if you try to move them out of the towns, the government has no plan to how do you deal with these declining towns. Again, I see this. China is still a very, very rural country, even with all the changes. This is the issues that China has to deal with. I think they need to look at Japan, take the warning signs from Japan, and get ahead of the curve.
Thank you.